Hey folks, welcome back. This is going to be a relatively short lecture on the distinction between independent contractor and employee and how that affects the profession. You can find more info in your textbook, The Medical Interpreter, in chapter 4.2. Also, I added links on the very last slide of the presentation of various articles and the IRS website. I refer to the articles in the slides. You will see brackets and numbers inside those brackets and the color. And of course, if you have any question, you know how to reach me. So medical interpreter can either be employees or self-employed, right? And self-employed is what an independent contractor is. If you go on the IRS website, you'll find a lot of very detailed information and link after link on the subject. So here I picked the most important distinction that I wanted to discuss. And don't worry, in the next slide, we will talk about employees. And then the slide after, we'll look at a table that compare both employees and independent contractor. So who are independent contractors? Well, people such as doctors, dentists, lawyers, accountants, contractors, and yes, medical interpreters who are in an independent trade or business or profession in which they offer their services to the general public are generally independent contractor. However, whether these people are independent contractors or employees depends on the fact in each case. But, and that's what I want to talk about, the most important distinction is, an individual is an independent contractor if the employer has the right to control or direct only the result of the work and not what will be done or how it will be done. So, in essence, someone can hire you to do a job, and if you're an independent contractor, they can tell you, this is the job I want done, but they can't dictate how you must do your job or the steps you have to take. So, that's the most important distinction that I want you to remember right now. I will add that as an independent contractor, you are self-employed because you work for yourself, which means you are your own small business. So all the earnings are subject to self-employment tax, where with an employer, they'll take care of that. And then if you work for an employer, you have certain protection. The most important is you are under the insurance of that employer. So what protection do you have as an independent contractor? Well, in your handbook, for example, they recommend liability insurance on page 195, if you want to look at it, as one thing that you can do to protect yourself as an independent contractor. All right, so now we've looked at what it means to be an independent contractor. Let's take a look at what it means to be an employee. If you perform services that can be controlled by an employer, so what or how the service must be done, even if you're giving freedom of action, you are not an independent contractor because the employer has the legal right to control the details of how the services are performed. So recall how with an independent contractor, your employer could only tell you, this is what I want, and then expect you to do the job, but they couldn't tell you how to do it. Well, if you're an employee, an employer can and has the legal right to tell you how to do your job, what steps you must take, etc. Something that is also different is if an employer-employee relationship exists, you are not an independent contractor and your earnings are not subject to self-employment tax, right? Then taxes become your employer responsibility. You don't have to factor that in. You will work that out with your employer when you're hired and fill different tax documents. So you might ask, cool, as an employee, a medical interpreter, who do I work with or for? Well, you might work for an LSP, which is a language service provider, that will hire you as a W-2 employee, which, as seen above, gives the company control over the entire spectrum of your work, but also pays for your taxes, insures you, etc., etc. If you want more info, it can be found in your handbook, or you can go on the IRS website. Reminder, I put the links on the last slide, or you can contact me and we can talk about it. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide because it's pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to include this table. You can find it in page 190, of your textbook. And it compares employees and self-employed contractors. So let's take a look at the first one. As an employee, you will submit regular timesheets, so weekly or bi-weekly or monthly, whereas a self-employed contractor, you will submit an invoice for the work performed, generally at the end. Usually, as an employee, you will receive, salary or wages. Again, it's regular. Where as a self-employed contractor, you will be paid by the job, and it's based on the invoice and the contract you sign. And then let's take a look at one more. Usually, as an employee, especially if you're full-time, you will work for just that company, where as a self-employed contractor, you will contract with several organizations. So that gives you a little more of an idea of the differences. Again, we can talk about it. Or you can look in your textbook, there are a little more examples. Eventually, you're going to ask yourself, so what should I do? Should I be an employee? Is it better for me to be my own boss? Well, there are no perfect answers. I wish there was one, but there is not. However, what I can give you is some thoughts. The first thing is it depends on the language that you speak, and of course it depends also of the geography, and it depends on what you want. What do I mean by that? Let's look at an example. I speak French, right? And so I'm a French-English medical interpreter, and when I did it years back, I had to ask myself, what do I want? Is it full-time work that I'm looking for? Is it part-time? What are my professional goals? And all of that came into consideration. Am I better off being at one company and being an employee, but then I might not get enough hours to be an interpreter, so I have to become a mentor, or I might become a supervisor to fill more hours? Or am I better off being an independent contractor where I can work for various organizations? I can contract in different regions of the United States. I might have bigger flexibilities, but then I'm my own boss, which means I have to figure out my own taxes, I have to insure myself, etc., etc. So those are things that you have to ask yourself. On the other hand, if you are an interpreter who has a language that is very high in demand, for example, in California, Spanish is one of them, you might find plenty of work with one company and then enjoying the employee model and not have to worry or have to think of other contracts. And it depends. You might be comfortable with one or the other. There's no better or worse option. It is based on personal preference. And then there's one more constraint, if we can say. It depends on the companies. Some companies have opted for the employee model and it works well for them. And some still prefer to opt for project-based contracts. So why? Because it depends. The employee status can be burdensome for some companies if it's highly specialized profession like interpreting because of cost consideration, or they might simply decide that it's not worth it because of X, Y, or Z reasons. And the opposite is true for other companies who opt for the employee model and who decide, well, that might work better for us. We have more control over the quality of the product. We can train our employees and our interpreters. It depends. So when I was doing research for this lesson, I found this article that was published in 2018 on Vocalink Global's website. That's a translation services. And there's part of the article, and I put the quote here on the slide, that I thought really reinforced a little bit of what I spoke about earlier. So I'm not going to read the quote because you don't need to hear me read it. I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. So they talked first about conference interpreting, and yes, often conference interpreter will be independent contractors, so they can contract with different companies or LSPs or organization. They might be working directly for the conference. So that gives them the flexibility to just go to different conferences, to work with the different companies that put on those different conferences. So in their case, that might be more advantages. But it also, at the end of the quote, talks about what they call the very rare language or lesser utility language that I talked about, like in my case, French, English here, where that might they might work as independent contractor because, and here I'm going to read just the end, interpreter take on contract work to fulfill the limited needs of various entities in a geographic region. So again, it might work better to do independent contracting work so that you can get more work and you can work in different regions, and you can feel your schedule or your work day, so to speak. We're going to look at some of the laws and cases that relate to independent contractor and how things have evolved in California over the years. We're not going to go into details. It's law. It can get quite convoluted, but I wanted to give you an idea of some of the stuff that happened. You will see that there are numbers in brackets. Those are connected to articles that you can find on the last slide. Here we go. So for over 30 years, there was what we called the Borrello test to determine how to classify a person as an employee or an independent contractor. This is a series of questions that would help a potential employer figure it out, right? And it's interesting because it's a multi-factor test that was established by the California Supreme Court. All the factors must be considered. No single factor determines classification. All are at the discretion of the judge reviewing the claim, etc. So it can get a little bit difficult, right? There's some ambiguity there. So then, after a case called Denemex was brought in front of the Supreme Court, where that was a case about, again, classification, independent contractor versus employee, the Supreme Court kind of changed the Borrello test and made it a three-part, a little bit more transparent ABC test, right? And so that ABC test had three questions that had to be kind of fulfilled to figure out or to decide if an employee was, if a person was an employee classified as an employee or an independent contractor, right? Those three are that, one, the worker is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity in connection with the performance of the work. Two, the worker performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. And three, the worker is engaged in an independently established trade of the same nature as that involved in the work performed. And yeah, that's like big language, la. The most important things to know is, according to the ABC text, the most important factor was the B, the usual course of business, which they had to be decided. In 2019, September 2019, Governor Newsom signed Assembly Bill AB 5, which addressed employment status when hiring entity claims that the person is hired is an independent contractor or not, right? And AB 5 required the application of the ABC tests to determine the classification. That quickly became an issue for interpreters, right? Or translators, because it confused the status, and it made it a little bit difficult for freelancers to figure out how to work, because contracts were canceled, because companies, so language service providers, were worried that they were misclassifying employees and independent contractor, and they wanted to avoid potential penalties under that new bill. So anyway, it was really a mess. And so a big majority of translator interpreters started opposing AB 5. And that happened. They worked with legislature to try to fix it and to get exemptions so that they could be part of a group of exempted profession that could be classified as independent contractor, or that would not be penalized under the new ABC tests or the new law. And while AB 5 came from a good place, which was to protect gig workers, right, workers like interpreters, from exploitation, people like translators and interpreter were highly educated and specialized, and they're not really gig workers, and that it did not reflect the realities of the language industry. Finally, after a lot of going back and forth, there was what was called the cleanup bill, AB 2557 passed, which finally gave interpreters and translators in California this exemption that they needed to perform their work and not be misclassified and lose contract because companies didn't know what to do or how to handle things. Interpreters and translators generally celebrated that as a success because the past bills would require a worker to be employees or businesses, right? There was it was very black and white. And so they couldn't, suddenly interpreters could not have independent contractor status. And that was really disruptive in the industry. So by gaining this exemption again, that kind of, it helped everybody breathe, and people were able to just go back to working the way they prefer or the way they could. A quick final thought, because not everybody knows, but yes, dreamers can work. You're going to ask how? Well, yeah, they might not have a social security number, SSN, but you can find more info on the IRS website. You can be assigned an ITIN, which is an individual taxpayer identification number. And some non-resident and resident aliens or their spouse or dependent, etc., who cannot otherwise get a social security number can get that, and then they can file taxes and work like you or I. So if you go under discussions, you will find the assignment related to this. I'd love for you to read the articles on the last page and discuss the following. What do you think? Employee or independent contractor? What is a better option for a medical or healthcare interpreter? I'd like you to just think about it and then just write a short paragraph telling me why you think one or the other might be better, or what you're looking 4, and then I'd like you to respond to at least one peer and not just a hey, that's cool, or woohoo, I love what you said, but actually think about what they said and then respond to it. If you have question, of course, you can contact me. Last slide. These are all the articles that I refer to in this PowerPoint presentation. Of course, also please read chapter 4.2 that has more information about what I've talked about.